I thought my wife was the perfect woman until a DNA test revealed she was sleeping with my father. What started as curiosity about my newborn son. His features became the most devastating discovery of my life. My name is Mark, and I'm 32 years old. I thought I had everything figured out. I was married to the woman of my dreams, had a decent job as an electrician, and we just bought our first house in a quiet suburb outside Denver. Life felt like it was finally falling into place. I met Jessica when I was 26 at a local coffee shop where she worked part-time while finishing her nursing degree. She had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. And the way she remembered every customer's order made me realize she genuinely cared about people. I started showing up there every morning, not just for the coffee, but hoping to catch a glimpse of her smile. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to ask her out. When I finally did, stumbling over my words like a teenager, she just grinned and said she was wondering when I'd finally stop pretending to need that much caffeine. Our first date lasted 8 hours. We went to dinner, then a movie, then just drove around talking until sunrise. I knew that night I wanted to marry her. Jessica fit into my family perfectly, which meant everything to me. My dad, Robert, had been my hero growing up. After my mom died when I was 15, it was just him and me against the world. He taught me how to fix cars, throw a football, and most importantly, how to treat a woman with respect. Your mother was a saint, he'd always say. Make sure whoever you marry knows she's got big shoes to fill, but that you'll worship the ground she walks on, just like I did with your mom. Dad was 55 when I brought Jessica home for the first time, still handsome in that rugged, salt-and-pepper way that made my female friends joke about daddy issues, but he was lonely. He'd dated a few women over the years, but nothing serious. He always said no one could compare to my mother. Jessica and my dad got along incredibly well, maybe too well, though I didn't think anything of it at the time. She'd laugh at his stories, ask about his work at the construction company he owned, and even started bringing him homemade meals when she knew he'd been working late. He's family, she'd say, when I teased her about spoiling him. Plus, he raised the man I love, so I owe him everything. We got married 2 years after we met in a small ceremony in my dad's backyard. Jessica looked absolutely radiant in her simple white dress, and when my dad walked her down the aisle, because her own father had passed away years earlier, I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such caring people in my life. During his speech at the reception, Dad got emotional talking about how Jessica reminded him of my mother's kindness and warmth. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped for. We settled into domestic bliss, with Sunday dinners at Dad's house becoming our weekly tradition. Jessica would cook, Dad would grill, and I'd handle cleanup while they sat on the porch talking about everything from politics to gardening tips. Sometimes I'd catch them in deep conversation and feel a warmth in my chest, knowing my two favorite people cared so much about each other. When Jessica got pregnant 8 months into our marriage, I thought life couldn't get any better. Dad was over the moon about becoming a grandfather. Started showing up with baby clothes, cribs, and enough toys to stock a store. This little one is going to be so spoiled, Jessica would laugh, rubbing her growing belly. Dad would just grin and say, "That's what granddads are for." Throughout her pregnancy, Dad was incredibly supportive, maybe even more than I expected. When Jessica had morning sickness, he'd bring her ginger tea and crackers. When she complained about back pain, he'd recommend heating pads and prenatal massages. When I had to work late, he'd keep her company, watching movies, or helping her organize the nursery. I was grateful for his involvement, especially since Jessica's own family lived across the country. Her mother had died when she was young, and her relationship with her stepfather was strained at best. Dad stepped into that parental role naturally, and Jessica seemed to flourish under his attention and care. The night our son Michael was born was the happiest day of my life. Holding that tiny, wrinkled little person in my arms, I felt a love I'd never experienced before. Dad cried when he first held his grandson, saying Michael had my mother's eyes. Jessica looked exhausted but beautiful, and when the 3 generations of our family were together in that hospital room, everything felt perfect. Looking back now, there were probably signs I should have noticed, but love makes you blind sometimes. The way Dad's hand would linger on Jessica's shoulder when he'd check on her, how they'd sometimes stop talking when I entered a room, the inside jokes they seemed to develop. But at the time, I just saw a grandfather who adored his daughter-in-law, and a wife who appreciated having a father figure in her life again. For the first few months of Michael's life, our routine continued. Dad would come over several times a week to help with the baby, giving Jessica breaks when I was at work. He'd changed plenty of diapers with me as a baby, so he was a natural. Jessica always seemed more relaxed when he was around. And I appreciated having someone I trusted completely helping raise my son. If someone had told me then what I would discover later, I would have laughed in their face. These were the two people I loved and trusted most in the world. The idea that they could betray me in such a devastating way was literally unthinkable. But as they say, the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how well it's hidden. The first crack in my perfect world appeared when Michael was about 6 months old. It started with something so innocent I almost dismissed it entirely. I was changing his diaper one evening when I noticed his eyes were in quite the same shade as either mine or Jessica. Mine are brown, Jessica's are green. Michael's seemed to be this unusual hazel color that didn't quite make sense genetically, though I'll admit I was never great at biology. When I mentioned it to Jessica, she just shrugged and said babies' eye colors change all the time. He probably gets it from your dad, she said without looking up from folding laundry. Robert has those pretty hazel eyes. The way she said pretty stuck with me, though I couldn't explain why. The second thing I noticed was how much time Jessica and Dad were spending together. I mean, I'd always been grateful for his help, especially since I was working overtime to save for Michael's future. But it seemed like every time I came home, Dad's truck was in our driveway. When I'd ask Jessica about it, she'd always have a perfectly reasonable explanation. He'd brought groceries. He'd fixed a leaky faucet. He'd wanted to see Michael. Your dad is so helpful, she'd say, usually while Dad gathered his tools or prepared to leave. I don't know what we'd do without him. Dad would just smile and ruffle my hair like I was still 10 years old. That's what family does, son. We take care of each other. But then I started noticing smaller things that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The way Jessica would dress up a little more when she knew Dad was coming over. How she'd put on makeup even if we weren't going anywhere. The way they'd be laughing about something when I walked in, and then suddenly change the subject to ask about my day. One Saturday morning, I decided to surprise them by coming home early from a work call. Finished the electrical job faster than expected, and thought I'd take Jessica and Michael out for breakfast. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see Dad's truck parked in our garage, which was weird because I'd never given him a garage door opener. I walked through the front door calling out hello, but got no immediate response. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, so I headed that way, assuming they were probably just having coffee while Michael napped. But as I got closer, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "We can't keep doing this," Jessica was saying in a hushed voice. "It's getting too complicated." "I know," Dad replied, his voice equally quiet, "but I can't help how I feel. When I look at Michael, when I look at you, that's when I cleared my throat loudly and walked into the kitchen. They both jumped apart like they'd been caught doing something wrong. Jessica was holding Michael, and Dad was standing by the coffee maker, but something about their body language seemed off. "Hey, you're home early," Jessica said, her voice a little too bright. "Your dad was just helping me with the garbage disposal. It's been making that weird noise again." I looked around the kitchen. No tools were out. The garbage disposal wasn't even running. But I forced a smile and said, "Thanks, Dad. I appreciate you taking care of things." The rest of that day felt strained and awkward. Dad left shortly after I arrived, claiming he had errands to run. Jessica seemed nervous and kept herself busy with household chores. When I tried to bring up what I'd overheard, she insisted I'd misunderstood. They were talking about Dad maybe dating again, she said. He'd been asking for advice about women, and she was encouraging him to put himself out there, but warning him about getting too attached too quickly. It made sense, sort of, but something still felt wrong. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to their interactions. I started noticing how Dad's eyes would follow Jessica around the room, how she'd touch his arm when she laughed at his jokes, how they seemed to communicate with glances and subtle expressions that I couldn't interpret. The breaking point came during one of our Sunday dinners. Michael was in his high chair making a mess with his pureed carrots, and we were all laughing at his antics. Dad reached over to wipe Michael's face, and Jessica said, "He's got your gentle touch." Then she caught herself, looking flustered. "I mean, he's got his grandfather's gentle touch, like father like son, you know." But the way she'd said it first, the way she'd looked at, Dad, the way they both suddenly became very interested in their food afterward. It all clicked into place in my mind like puzzle pieces I'd been trying to ignore. That night after Dad left and Jessica was giving Michael his bath, I sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes, trying to process what I was starting to suspect. The timeline would work. Jessica and Dad had spent a lot of time together during her pregnancy when I was working late. Michael's eye color, the way they acted around each other, the overheard conversation about things being complicated. When I finally went back inside, I found Jessica already in bed pretending to be asleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Was I being paranoid? Was grief over my mother's absence making me see things that weren't there? Or was my gut instinct telling me something my heart didn't want to accept? The next morning, Jessica seemed back to her normal self, making coffee and humming while she fed Michael his breakfast. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a house built on lies, and that everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my family was about to come crashing down around me. The idea of a DNA test first entered my mind during a sleepless night about 2 weeks after that awkward Sunday dinner. I'd been lying in bed, listening to Jessica's steady breathing, when Michael started crying from his crib. As I got up to check on him, something my coworker had mentioned months earlier suddenly popped into my head. Tommy had been going through his own family drama. When his sister claimed their deceased father wasn't really her biological dad, hoping to contest the will. Man, these DNA tests nowadays, he'd said while we were pulling wire through a commercial building. You can find out anything you want to know for like $50. Sometimes I think ignorance was bliss, you know? I'd laughed it off then, but now those words kept echoing in my mind. $50 to know for sure? $50 to either confirm my paranoid suspicions or put them to rest forever. The next few days were torture. I'd catch myself staring at Michael, trying to see resemblances to me, to Jessica, to Dad. Every time I looked at my son, I felt this horrible mix of overwhelming love and growing doubt. He was such a beautiful baby, always smiling, reaching for me when I came home from work. The thought that he might not be mine felt like betrayal of the worst kind. Not just by Jessica, and potentially my father, but by my own suspicious mind. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Babies look like all sorts of relatives. Eye color is complicated. Jessica loved me, I was sure of that. And Dad, well, Dad had been my rock my entire life. These were the two people I trusted most in the world. But then I'd remember that hushed conversation, the way they looked at each other. Jessica's slip about Michael having Dad's gentle touch. After a week of mental torture, I made a decision that felt both necessary and like the ultimate betrayal. I was going to get a paternity test, just to put my mind at ease. I told myself it was really about proving my suspicions wrong, about being able to look at my wife and son without these poisonous thoughts clouding every interaction. The hardest part was collecting the samples without arousing suspicion. I researched it online during my lunch breaks, learning that I'd need DNA from Michael and from myself, and potentially from Dad if I wanted to test that particular theory. The test kit would arrive in discreet packaging, and I could mail it back anonymously. Getting Michael's sample was heartbreaking. The kit required a simple cheek swab, which I could do during one of his diaper changes. But as I gently rubbed the cotton swab inside his little mouth while he gurgled and smiled at me, I felt like the worst father in the world. Here was this innocent baby who trusted me completely, and I was essentially questioning his entire existence in our family. My own sample was easy enough, just another cheek swab done in the bathroom while Jessica was grocery shopping. But getting Dad's DNA required more creativity and felt like crossing a line I'd never imagined I'd cross. The opportunity came the following Sunday during our usual dinner. Dad had been drinking beer from a bottle, and when he stepped outside to check something in his truck, I quickly grabbed the bottle and sealed it in a plastic bag. My hands were shaking as I hid it in my toolbox in the garage. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, and it made me sick to my stomach. Mailing the samples felt like signing my own death warrant. What if my suspicions were right? What would that mean for Michael, for my marriage, for my relationship with my father? What if they were wrong? How could I ever look Jessica or Dad in the eye again, knowing I doubted them so completely? The waiting period was supposed to be 7 to 10 business days, but it felt like 7 lifetimes. Every interaction with Jessica became loaded with meaning I wasn't sure was real. When she'd mention Dad, I'd analyze her tone. When she'd kiss me goodbye in the morning, I'd wonder if she was thinking about someone else. When she'd play with Michael, I'd watch for signs of guilt or secrets in her expressions. Jessica noticed my mood change, of course. "You've been so quiet lately," she said one evening while we were watching TV. "Is everything okay at work? You seem stressed." I wanted to tell her everything. Part of me hoped she'd just confess, explain everything, make it all make sense in a way that wouldn't destroy our family. But instead, I just said I was tired from all the overtime and pulled her closer on the couch. Dad seemed oblivious to my internal turmoil, or maybe he was just better at hiding his own stress. He still came by regularly, still helped with Michael, still treated me like the son he'd raised with love and patience. If he was hiding something, he was doing a masterful job of it. The night before I expected the results to arrive, I barely slept at all. I kept thinking about what each possible outcome would mean. Best case scenario, Michael was definitely my son, and I could put these horrible suspicions behind me and focus on rebuilding the trust ID, let doubt erode. Worst case scenario, my wife had cheated on me with my own father, and the child I'd been loving and caring for wasn't biologically mine. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to Michael's soft breathing through the baby monitor, I realized something important. No matter what those test results said, I loved that little boy with every fiber of my being. He was my son in every way that mattered, regardless of genetics. The real question wasn't about Michael's paternity. It was about whether I could trust the two adults in my life, who were supposed to love and respect me above all others. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I couldn't focus on anything except waiting for the mail carrier to arrive with the envelope that would either restore my peace of mind or shatter my world completely. The envelope arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. I know the exact time because I'd been checking the mail every hour since 10 a.m. And when I finally saw that plain white envelope with the lab's return address, I stood at the mailbox for a full minute, unable to make my hands move to open it. Jessica had taken Michael to his 6-month pediatric appointment, which meant I had the house to myself when the moment of truth arrived. I've been both dreading and praying for this scenario all week. Whatever I was about to discover, I wanted to process it alone first, before figuring out how to handle the aftermath. I sat down at our kitchen table. It's the same table where we'd eaten countless meals as a family, where Dad had helped Michael try solid foods for the first time, where Jessica and I had planned our future together. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the envelope down twice before I could tear it open. The document inside was clinical and straightforward, nothing like the emotional bomb I knew it might contain. There were charts and numbers and technical terms, but I skipped all of that and went straight to the summary section at the bottom. Alleged father, Mark Thompson. Probability of paternity, 0%. I stared at those words until they blurred together. 0%. Michael wasn't my biological son. The baby I'd held during his first breaths, whose diapers I'd changed, whose middle-of-the-night cries I'd responded to for 6 months, wasn't genetically related to me at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the second set of results. Alleged father, Robert Thompson. Probability of paternity, 99.7%. My father, my own father, was Michael's biological father. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I know I must have made some kind of sound because our neighbor's dog started barking. I know I swept everything off the kitchen table, because I later found Jessica's coffee mug broken on the floor. I know I called my boss and told him I wouldn't be coming in for the rest of the week, because I found that voicemail on my phone later. When the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a rage so intense I thought I might actually be having a heart attack. My chest felt tight, my vision got blurry, and my hands were clenched into fists so tight my knuckles went white. How could they do this to me? How could my own father, the man who raised me, who taught me about loyalty and honor and treating people right, betray me in the most devastating way possible? And Jessica, my wife, who'd promised to forsake all others, who'd looked me in the eye every day for months, while carrying another man's child and letting me believe it was mine. She'd watched me fall in love with Michael, watched me make plans for his future, watched me work extra hours to provide for my son, all while knowing the truth. I found myself pacing around the house like a caged animal, picking up framed photos of our family and wanting to throw them against the wall. Here was our wedding photo, with Dad looking so proud as he walked Jessica down the aisle. Here was Michael's first Christmas, with all three of us smiling like we were the perfect, happy family. Here was a picture of Dad holding newborn Michael in the hospital. And now I could see what I'd missed before, the resemblance that should have been obvious. The sound of Jessica's car pulling into the driveway sent my adrenaline spiking again. I quickly gathered up the DNA test results and shoved them into my toolbox in the garage. I needed time to figure out how to handle this, what to say, what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to scream and demand explanations. But another part of me knew that once I opened this door, there would be no going back. Everything would change forever. Jessica came through the front door, carrying Michael in his car seat, chattering about the pediatrician visit. "Dr. Martinez says he's growing perfectly," she said, setting the carrier down and starting to unbuckle our son. "He's in the 75th percentile for height, just like his daddy." The casual way she said his daddy, while looking right at me, made my stomach turn. Which daddy was she talking about? Did she even know I'd found out the truth? "Michael was such a good boy for his shots," she continued, lifting him out of the carrier. "Barely cried at all. Dr. Martinez said he's got a high pain tolerance, probably genetic." I watched her holding Michael, bouncing him gently, and making those silly faces that always made him giggle, and I felt like I was watching strangers. This woman I'd loved, this child I'd adored, they suddenly seemed like actors in a play I'd been unknowingly watching from the audience. "You're quiet," Jessica observed, walking over to kiss my cheek while still holding Michael. "Rough day?" The normalcy of the gesture, the way she was acting like everything was fine, while my world had just exploded, made me feel physically ill. I mumbled something about being tired and escaped to the garage, claiming I needed to organize some tools. I sat in my truck in the garage with the DNA results spread across my lap, trying to figure out my next move. Should I call Dad and confront him first? Should I pack a bag and leave? Should I demand Jessica tell me the truth before revealing what I knew? One thing was crystal clear. I couldn't pretend everything was normal. I couldn't sit through another family dinner, couldn't watch Dad play grandfather to his own son, while patting me on the back about what a great father I was. I couldn't kiss my wife goodnight, knowing she'd been living a lie for over a year. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I actually started laughing, though it sounded more like sobbing. My father and my wife. The two people who were supposed to love me most in the world had conspired to deceive me in the cruelest way imaginable. As I sat there in the growing darkness of the garage, holding the proof of their betrayal, I knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of my life. I decided to confront my father first. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was strategy, but I needed to hear his version before facing Jessica. Dad had always been a straight shooter, even when the truth was painful. If anyone was going to come clean, it would be him. I called him that evening after Jessica had gone to bed, asking if he could meet me for coffee first thing in the morning. "Just the two of us," I said. "There's something important I need to discuss with you." Dad must have heard something in my voice because he agreed immediately, no questions asked. We arranged to meet at a diner across town, somewhere neutral, where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images that made me sick. My father and my wife together. The lies, the deception, the months of playing happy family, while I was the only one who didn't know the truth. I kept thinking about all the times Dad had come over to help while I was working late, all those evening visits, weekend afternoons, the way Jessica always seemed so happy to see him. The next morning, I told Jessica I had an early job and left before she was fully awake. I arrived at the diner 30 minutes early and sat in a corner booth drinking coffee that tasted like ash and rehearsing what I was going to say. How do you ask your father if he's been sleeping with your wife? How do you accuse the man who raised you of the ultimate betrayal? Dad walked in looking concerned, his work clothes neat despite the early hour. He'd always been a man who took pride in his appearance. Seeing him now, I could understand why Jessica might have found him attractive. He was still handsome at 55, still strong from years of construction work, still had that easy charm that made people feel comfortable around him. "You look like hell, son," he said, as he slid into the booth across from me. "What's going on? Is everything okay with Jessica and the baby?" The concern in his voice sounded so genuine that for a moment I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I remembered those test results, the cold, clinical proof of what had happened. I pulled the DNA test papers out of my jacket and placed them on the table between us. I watched his face carefully as his eyes scanned the document, looking for any sign of surprise or confusion. Instead, I saw his shoulders sag and his face go pale. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Jesus Christ, he whispered, his hands shaking as he set the papers down. How long have you known? Since yesterday, I replied, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I've suspected for weeks, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. I kept thinking there was no way my own father would do this to me. Dad put his head in his hands and was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Mark, I am so sorry. You have to believe me when I tell you this isn't how I wanted you to find out. This isn't how I wanted any of this to happen, so it's true. I asked, even though I already knew the answer. You and Jessica. Yes, he said simply. It's true. Hearing him confirm it felt like being punched in the chest. Even with the DNA evidence, some small part of me had been hoping for a different explanation. Some miraculous misunderstanding that would make everything okay again. How long? I asked. Dad was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. It started about 8 months into your marriage. Jessica was having problems, feeling lonely because you were working so much overtime. She needed someone to talk to. So you decided to sleep with her? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, loud enough that other diners turned to look at us. It wasn't supposed to happen, Dad said desperately. I was trying to help her, to be supportive. She reminded me so much of your mother, and I've been so lonely since she died. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we'd crossed the line we couldn't uncross. Don't you dare bring Mom into this, I hissed. Don't you dare use her memory to justify what you did. You're right, he said immediately. I'm sorry. There's no excuse for what I did. No justification. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I've hated myself for it every single day since it started. Since it started, I repeated, You mean it's still going on? Dad's silence was answer enough. The affair hadn't been a one-time mistake or a brief lapse in judgment. It had been an ongoing relationship that lasted through Jessica's pregnancy and into Michael's infancy. They'd been lying to me for over a year. Michael, I said, my voice breaking on my son's name. Did you know he was yours when he was born? We suspected, Dad admitted. The timing made it possible. We hoped he was yours. We wanted him to be yours. But you didn't stop seeing each other, I pointed out. Even after Michael was born, even when you thought he might be my son, you kept the affair going. Dad nodded miserably. I know how it sounds. I know there's no excuse. But I love her, Mark. I know I have no right to. I know it's wrong, but I do. Those words hit me like a physical blow. It was one thing to think they'd been having a meaningless affair driven by loneliness or lust. It was another thing entirely to hear my father say he loved my wife. Does she love you too? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She says she does, he replied quietly. But she loves you too, son. This whole situation has been tearing her apart. She never wanted to hurt you. But she did hurt me, I said, standing up from the booth. You both did. Destroyed my marriage, my family, my trust in the two people who were supposed to love me most. And you did it while letting me believe Michael was my son. He is your son, Dad said urgently. In every way that matters, Mark. You've raised him, you've loved him, you've been his father from day one. Biology doesn't change that. Don't, I said, backing away from the table. Don't try to make this about what's best for Michael. Should have thought about that before you started sleeping with his mother. I left the diner without another word, leaving Dad sitting alone with the DNA test results and the wreckage of our relationship scattered across the table between us. The confrontation with Jessica was still ahead of me, and I had no idea how I was going to survive it. The confrontation with Jessica that evening was somehow both explosive and anticlimactic at the same time. When I walked into our house carrying the DNA test results, she took one look at my face and knew immediately that our charade was over. You know, she said simply, sitting on our couch with Michael in her lap. so I would glad I went with I know, I replied, setting the papers on the coffee table where she could see them. She didn't even look at the documents. Instead, she started crying silently, holding Michael closer as if she could protect him from what was happening. I'm so sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry. The apology I'd been wanting to hear for weeks felt hollow now that I finally had it. Sorry didn't undo a year of lies. Sorry didn't change the fact that the child I'd been raising wasn't biologically mine. Sorry didn't repair the trust that had been shattered beyond recognition. How long were you going to keep lying to me? I asked, sitting in the chair across from them. Were you ever going to tell me the truth? Or were you just going to let me live this lie forever? I don't know, she admitted. At first, we thought it was just a one-time mistake. Then when I got pregnant, we hoped the baby was yours. When Michael was born and started looking more like Robert, we knew we had to stop, but we couldn't seem to end it. The longer it went on, the harder it became to tell you the truth. So you chose to keep lying. I chose to try to keep our family together, she said defensively. I love you, Mark. I never stopped loving you. Happened with your father. It doesn't change how I feel about you. But it changes how I feel about you, I replied. How could it not? You've been living a double life for over a year. Every kiss, every I love you, every moment of intimacy we shared, you were hiding this massive secret. How am I supposed to trust anything you say ever again? That conversation lasted 3 hours and resolved nothing. Jessica begged me to consider counseling, to think about Michael, to remember the good years we'd had together, but I couldn't see past the deception. Every memory felt contaminated now. Had she been thinking about Dad when we made love? Had they laughed about my obliviousness? Had I been the fool in my own life story? I moved out that weekend, staying in a motel while I figured out what came next. The hardest part was leaving Michael. Regardless of biology, he was still the baby I'd loved for 6 months. He still reached for me when I walked into a room, still smiled when I made silly faces, still fell asleep peacefully in my arms. But being around him now felt like living in a constant reminder of my wife's betrayal. The legal proceedings that followed were brutal. Divorce papers, custody arrangements, property division. Since I wasn't Michael's biological father, I had no legal rights to him, which felt like losing my child all over again. Jessica was willing to allow visits, but Dad's parental rights complicated everything. The lawyer explained that the man who'd raised me from 15 was now legally more Michael's father than I was. The worst part was how the truth affected other relationships in my life. My co-workers didn't know how to act around me once word got out. Some people looked at me with pity. Others whispered behind my back about how I'd been cuckolded by my own father. The shame was overwhelming, even though logically I knew I was the victim in this situation. My friendship with Tommy from work actually helped me through the darkest period. He'd been through his own family drama and understood that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of unimaginable betrayal. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty, he told me one evening over beers. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. It took me almost 2 years to stop feeling angry every day. 2 years of therapy, of rebuilding my life from scratch, of learning to trust my own judgment again.